To Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond. Joining us on the line is Dr. Gerald Horne, Dr. Gerald Charles Horne, author of the Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. That is his latest volume. And he has about 40 other volumes about everything from Hank Aaron to Shaka and the Zulus. He covers the waterfront. And Dr. Horne, how are you doing today, sir?
Hey, it's all good.
Really, really good, huh?
Really good.
The first... I guess the first question we wanted to talk about Macron in Algeria, but before we start, I guess Algeria was colonized by the French, I guess in 1830, and they fought a real serious battle with France, and they were independent. And I don't remember what exact year they gained their independence. But we, as Black people in the United States and around the world, were very impressed with Ahmed Ben Bella. And Ahmed Ben Bella actually had a meeting with Dr. Martin Luther King. And Dr. Martin Luther King was really impressed with Ben Bella, and later the leader of who overthrew Ben Bella, he allowed the Black Panthers to have an international section. The international section of the Black Panther Party had an office in Algeria. So I guess the first question we wanted to talk about was Macron's visit to Algeria. What was that all about?
Well, it's about the crisis in Europe. Mr. Macron gave this startling speech the other day where he told the French people that the age of abundance, I'm not sure if that age of abundance ever reached many French people, but that's another story. But he said the age of abundance is over. He was referring to the fact that this sanctions regime against Moscow has backfired. It's almost as if the European nations are sanctioning themselves. Inflation is up. It's estimated that in Britain, that energy costs this winter will rise by 80%. Which is going to devastate budgets in London. The Tories, speaking of the probable incoming Prime Minister Liz Truss, instead of talking about subsidies for heat or windfall taxes on these energy monopolies, is talking about cutting taxes. And so, in a sense, what Mr. Macron was doing was singing the song that capitalist leaders oftentimes sing, that is to say, the song of austerity. And so he went to Algeria because Algeria is a major producer of natural gas. Natural gas to Europe oftentimes comes via Russian pipelines. But since there's a sanctions regime against Russia, that's now problematic. And as we've been talking about on this program for months now, if you don't rely on Russia, you're going to have to rely on Africa, in this case, Algeria. So Mr. Macron went cap in hand to Algiers, begging for forgiveness, apologizing for the decades of bloody and brutal colonial rule. And in terms of the prelude to our discussion about Algeria, I think I should also mention Frantz Fanon of the Caribbean, the well-known psychiatrist and writer who was in strict solidarity with the Algerian revolutionaries and, of course, wrote a number of books, including The Wretched of the Earth, that are still being consulted. And in fact, as you know, I've been doing this project on the Black Panther Party, and they were heavily reliant upon the works of one Frantz Fanon. In any case, this visit of Mr. Macron, it's going to be rather difficult, not only because of France's inglorious history of brutalization of Africans, but also because the Algerian state has been very adroit and adept at manipulating Western European countries one against another. For example, before Mr. Macron came to Algeria, you had leaders of both Spain and Italy trying to court Algiers, and Algiers was quite proficient in terms of playing one state off against another. And so once again, just to step back and look from 30,000 feet, it is highly possible that we are at a turning point, a hinge moment in terms of this small planet. And one of the indicators of this hinge moment might be the latest bout of instability that Western Europe is enduring. In fact, on RT, the Moscow-based station, the commentators just this past week were referring to Western Europe in an insulting manner, insulting in every respect, as you shall shortly hear. They were referring to Western Europe as the so-called third world of the North Atlantic bloc, or of the capitalist world. Now, that may be a bridge too far, but it certainly bespeaks the crisis that's afflicting Western Europe. And one would think that what ignited the crisis, speaking of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and its creeping ever closer to the doorstep of Moscow, that would call for second thoughts with regard to the Ukraine conflict. Now, thus far, at least on the surface, I don't see those second thoughts. The still Prime Minister Boris Johnson was just in Ukraine this past week, promising more military aid. You see the U.S. promising more military aid, although in all fairness, it should be said that this is more of a boon to the military-industrial complex in the United States more than Ukraine, because some of these weapons might not reach Ukraine for 3 years. In 3 years, there might not even be a Ukraine. So these are just contracts that Washington is signing with U.S. arms manufacturers to build more weapons that supposedly will be delivered in 36 months. This whole conflict, from the point of view of the West Bank of the Atlantic, has been a real scam.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. This was the 60th anniversary of, I want to go back to Algeria. This is the 60th anniversary of Algeria, and they gained independence in 1962. Did Macron even mention that he acknowledged the 60th anniversary? And then we can go on.
Well, I'm not sure. It would not be surprising to me if he did not. But Norman, may I add a footnote here?
Go ahead.
There is a current controversy in the United States involving James Sweet, who is the president of the American Historical Association, the largest body of historians in the United States, if not the world. And he recently wrote a column. Now, keep in mind that James Sweet at the University of Wisconsin-Madison is a specialist on Africa. So he wrote a column basically reprimanding the movie by Viola Davis, which deals with the women warriors of yesterday's Dahomey, today's Benin, of decades ago. He reprimanded the 1619 Project, naturally, because that's a real problem for these mainstream historians. He reprimanded the tourism industry of Ghana for suggesting that certain slave castles helped to disperse what are now African Americans across the Atlantic. But in my investigation of this reproaching that he made, and of course the bottom line was he was reproaching historians, although he didn't mention them. He mentioned a screenplay writer, he mentioned a tourist guide, he mentioned a journalist, Nicole Hannah-Jones, but actually he was taking pot shots at historians, likely historians like myself.
At you.
Exactly. But as they say, he did not. He decided not to go there. But after doing some investigating, what I came to realize is that there are a number of Euro-American scholars who specialize in African-American studies who are very resentful of their African-American peers, because it's felt, I think, that African-American peers like myself have a certain amount of credibility because we're of African descent. Now, maybe that's true, but I was born this way. I can't help it. I mean, don't blame me for being black. I mean, after all, we spent centuries being penalized for being black, so perhaps there should be some compensation in it. In any case, but also, I do jazz studies as well. I did this book, Jazz and Justice, and I still participate in jazz studies forums. And the jazz studies forums, needless to say, are mostly these obsessive Euro-American male fans of the music who do not like to discuss racism in the music. I mean, as a matter of fact, they've threatened to expel certain black critics who want to discuss this issue. That's just off the limits. That's off limits. So the question I raise is to you, Norman, since you do music, you live in Toronto. I'm wondering if what I'm saying, has that been part of your experience?
Yes, sir. There is a group called the Toronto Blues Society, and I remember them not allowing me to even get a ticket to sit in on to go to their concerts. I think the first time I really went to a Toronto Blues Society, there's a young man by the name of Donald. He was Donald was with the Taste of Honey. He was a drummer in the Taste of Honey, and he was the headline in the show. He got me in. And I had a guest with me. We went to the thing, and they don't recognize me, and I would always laugh at them and say that, my grandmother, Virgil Glover, he was born Virgil Glover. She was born in Goodman, Mississippi. And, I saw Bobby Blue Bland when I was 9 years old. And I can go Elmore James. And I mean, some people call me the bluesologist, but I can't get arrested by these Euro critics in Toronto, and it's been a trip. It's been a trip, a real trip.
Well, I have to say, I'm disappointed but not surprised.
Well, you know that Bobby Rush, the great blues singer Bobby Rush, was born near me in Louisiana. He's quite a few years older than me, and he came to Toronto, and I didn't even get a chance to meet him. I mean, he was born maybe 20 miles from where I was born, and I play his music all the time. He had a song out called "I Got to Find My Keys," and he did that on Philadelphia International. And Bobby Rush is an author, and I hate to drop names, but I spoke to him the other day. He's over in Europe, and I spoke to him for a few minutes. So I think I do have some credibility in the so-called Blues Society, but the Toronto Blues Society, they treat me worse than a stepchild.
Well, as I said, with James Sweet, the University of Wisconsin-Madison committing to paper something that he probably should not have written. Now the controversy is out there. Of course, he's apologized, but the underlying problem still persists. And I should also mention that one of his predecessors at Wisconsin-Madison, Philip Curtin, C-U-R-T-I-N, you might have heard of him. He was a leading historian of the African slave trade. He made similar complaints before he passed away. As a matter of fact, Sweet might even have his job, about how he didn't like the idea that the West Africans were having these special tourism packages for Black Americans when supposedly we didn't come from that part of Africa. I mean, and then about the Viola Davis movie, it hasn't been released yet, so obviously he hasn't seen it. But it's going back centuries that creative types take history and refashion it. I mean, do you think when you see Shakespeare's Richard III that that's a documentary? I mean, so it was really remarkable and expose how far we have to go. Because supposedly this is a quote ally unquote. However, as the saying goes, with allies like that, who needs enemies?
Yeah, and a lot of problems. I think one of the problems that African people, not just in the United States but around the world, is like the allies want to lead us. You know, like allies are supposed to be in a supportive role, but our allies, the quote unquote allies, they don't want. They want to lead us.
Well, I think that's part of the problem. That's what I was alluding to when I was saying that there is resentment of a scholar like myself, because there's this perception that Black people would see me as more of an intellectual leader than our melanin deficient counterparts. And I mean, if that's really the concern, these people should ask historically why that's the case. And maybe that'll bring them back to a serious analysis of white supremacy, which of course they don't want to engage in. But I don't want to spend too much time on this issue because there are other pressing issues like this Angolan election that took place just a few days ago, Southwest Africa. The MPLA, which has been in power since independence in 1975, won, although its margin was reduced. Its chief opponent is UNITA, or the movement that used to be the favorite African resistance movement of the right wing in the United States when it was led by Jonas Savimbi, who died a few decades ago. And Angola is a case of an African nation that really has suffered with regard to the declension of the socialist camp, because with the decline of the socialist camp and the hegemony of the North Atlantic countries led by the United States, they were able to dictate to these African countries what they should do internally. Of course, socialism was taken off the table, was seen as depriving capitalists of democratic rights. And so what happens is that Angola, with this fabulous oil wealth and diamond wealth, was forced to privatize. And you see this in many countries, including China and South Africa, where when countries are forced to privatize, they realize that that wealth will create a political force. So they try to privatize within the family, sometimes literally. So the previous Angolan president, José Eduardo dos Santos, who just died in Spain a few weeks ago and left office about 5 or 6 years ago, when they privatized within the family. His daughter is one of the richest women on planet Earth, one of the, certainly probably second to Oprah Winfrey as the richest Black woman. And so there's a lot of discontent in Angola. And so their margin, the MPLA's margin of victory was reduced. I should also say that episode in 1975. I only recount it because I think it's important to recount history to younger people so they'll know how we got to where we are today. That is to say that in 1975, when Angola was coming to independence, apartheid South Africa, the US CIA, and I'm afraid to say assisted by Maoist China and certain black nationalist forces, were opposing the MPLA because they were backed by the Soviet Union and Cuba. And of course, Cuba helped to rescue the MPLA by beating back the invasion by South African apartheid forces. Now, as a person who was up to my eyeballs in that struggle, and it's recounted in my book, White Supremacy Confronted, younger people may find it hard to believe that when many of the black nationalists, when they opposed the MPLA because they thought that it was too heavily dominated by so-called mixed race people, because then the Portuguese, who were the major colonizing force arriving in Angola in the 16th century, it's a small country, contemporary population of 9 million. It was seeking to colonize gigantic Brazil and Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau and East Timor and Macau and Goa as part of India at the same time. So it relied heavily upon so-called mulattoes, some of whom, of course, did not support settler colonialism or colonialism at all. They joined the MPLA, but that was insufficient for many of these black nationalists who saw them, because their melanin content or lack thereof, as being antagonists. Not to mention that some of them were married to European women, which was very curious, because if you look at the history of black Americans, you see Adam Clayton Powell, Louis Farrakhan, Julian Bond, perhaps even Elijah Muhammad. You have this core of leaders who were melanin deficient. So it was all a very curious episode, and it wasn't the finest hour for black Americans, many of whom are still around and have yet to explain their positions.
Let me say that I supported Jonas Savimbi for a few moments. I think Ilombe Brad supported, the Patrice Lumumba Coalition supported Jonas Savimbi for a few moments. I remember I was doing some work for the United Nations, and I was in the Toronto Public Library downtown, and I found an article from a South African newspaper with Jonas Savimbi drinking champagne in the South African embassy. And I remember I had to report that to the UN situation, and that basically pulled my coat as to Jonas Savimbi was he was basically a straight up traitor. And the argument he used was that all of the MPLA leaders were married to white women. At the same time, Mobutu had about he married identical twins, and he was a womanizer he had women on top of women on top of women. I don't know if he had white women, but the whole thing about the treatment of women was not even taken into consideration. I guess as long as they were of African ancestors, you could do whatever you wanted to do with them. But yeah, I remember taking that position, like I say, for about a month. But once we found out, that was, like you're saying, that was basically a sham that they were using in order to get support from black people in the Western Hemisphere, or wouldn't you say that?
Oh, sure. And as I said, my book covers that whole struggle in some detail. So I
remember that.
Younger people to my book. But speaking of women, I wanted to also mention that I've been watching this drama by one of your fellow Canadians. I think she lives in Ontario. Speaking of Margaret Atwood.
Yes, sir.
It's a dramatization of her novel Handmaid's Tale, which is really a sort of a science fiction about gender apartheid. And I think one of the reasons why it resonates is because it portrays this dystopian society, anti-utopian society, where women are no more than birthing machines. And they're presided over by these core of right-wing men. Some of the movie is very hard to watch. I mean, very painful to watch in certain cases. But I mention it because I haven't seen any journalism on this, but I suspect that the movie is having political impact in light of the overthrow of Roe versus Wade and women's reproductive freedom here in the United States. Because I think one of the reasons why the movie resonates is because this idea of women as birthing machines, we're about 2 or 3 steps from that in the United States. In fact, interestingly enough, when women try to escape, they escape to Canada, believe it or not. So I'm wondering, are you familiar with Margaret Atwood or familiar with her reputation in Ontario?
Oh, very much so. She, there is a Native American woman. I'll send you the link, and I'll talk about the link. I'll put the link up, and I'll also talk about it. But there's a Native American woman who basically talks about Margaret Atwood. First of all, I saw it in an interview with Margaret Atwood, and in terms of climate change, I give her a 10. She basically takes a similar position that, Commandante Fidel Castro says, that climate change might be the hottest issue, along with the threat of nuclear war. That's an issue that I don't care what color or you are or what nationality, the whole question of climate change is big, 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 big. But this Native American woman basically say Margaret Atwood is full of doo-doo, and she is basically a white chauvinist. Euro-American chauvinist, and she's trying to equate the woman's question with the white women's part. The Euro-Canadian woman is just as oppressed as those people that are colonized. Black people in America colonized black people, African people. Period. We are a colonial people, and Atwood's basic position is that women suffer the same as colonial black people and other colonial people. And this Native American woman, I'll send you the link, basically says that Atwood is basically full of it, and she's basically just another white chauvinist.
It's interesting. There's a black woman character, but she escapes. So therefore she does. And what's interesting is for these women who are oppressed and subjugated, she has these graphic scenes of them being forced. I guess let's be blunt. It's rape, forced into sexual intercourse so they can produce babies. However, the black woman who escapes, there are never any scenes of her being subjected thusly. And so I was thinking from the point of view of the screenplay that this allows Atwood to avoid dealing with the race question. And I don't know. I haven't finished the series, so I'll give another report next week.
Yes, but I mean, I'm going to find that there's a Native American sister, First Nations woman, and she calls Miss Atwood everything but a child of Allah or a child of Jah. She talks about her. It's rough. She has absolutely little or no respect for Ms. Atwood.
Well, I'll finish the series in any case and let you all know my ultimate opinion.
All right. I think we have run out of time. Is there anything you'd like to add, Melinda?
No, I think we'll see everybody in the whirlwind next week.
Oh, Melinda, before we go, have you seen Handmaid's Tale?
No, I'm also like, I have to be in a space to be able to watch it, because I've been told it's like, yeah. So I haven't watched it yet. So
What,
I
what,
will
what,
report back when I do.
what
But
have you
I've
been
read
told?
the book. Yeah, I had to read the book.
What have you been told?
Basically, you know, it's intense. Like, because I read the book. I read it in high school, so I know the story, and so I haven't really watched the series yet because, yeah, how intense it is. Like, you know. So, but yeah, I'm interested in reading that. You know, because her work is also like, you know, it's very similar to Octavia Butler, right? So, I kind of more read her books. So, yeah, so yeah, it would be interesting to watch it, and I will report back as well.
No, great.
Yeah.
All right, so we will see everyone in the whirlwind, and